All right, guys, today we have got the Evolution CR Plus 2024 version. I know some people have been waiting on this. I know I've had it for a while. Some of you guys see me on Facebook. I've had this for, over 2 weeks now. So we're finally getting around to doing a review on it. So what we're going to do, we're going to do a review. We'll do a breakdown on it. We're going to do a little bit of spraying. When I get back to the end, we'll talk a few things about it. And we are also going to talk about one of the things that everybody wants to know is the delay people have talked about in the trigger better. We're gonna talk pretty deep about that when we get to the end of the video. Let's get into the tear down, and then we'll get into some spray outs, and then we'll come back towards the end. Okay, so there are some new features of the CR Plus 2024 that people have talked about. It's got a new head assembly, and this, they've talked about how easy it is to adjust this. I do not personally use needle limiters. However, they've talked about it, so we got to talk about it. So I have determined it takes 2 turns from full open to full close. Just shy of 2 turns maybe. But see, there's full close. 1 turn. There is about 1 3/4 turn to get to the full travel of the needle. So we're going to take this apart, and anybody who knows anything about Harder and Steenbeck knows people have talked about all the time how easy they are to break down. And they absolutely are very, very easy to break down. This will be probably the fastest. I'm going to go ahead, and you have to pull that off to pull the needle guard off. Toolless design, simple, easy to service nozzle. That is pretty much all you're ever going to take off the brush or the cup. Very, very simple. Do not need any tools. All of the parts internally, all the manufacturing, it shouldn't even come as a question. It is going to be very much top notch. Although, since, Harder and Steenbeck is praised all the time for having incredibly well machined parts, I was a little put off by the fact that I can actually see the machining on the business end of the needle. And it was surprising because normally you'll see the spring steel needles they use are not really super finely polished. But in this case, they actually, you can tell, they polished the needles, or they're buying them pre-polished, really high quality. But then they did not bother to, do any polishing on that. In practice, I've been running this brush a couple weeks. I have felt no need to worry about it. So it was kind of surprising to me when I first pulled it out of the box, but I'm not going to bother polishing it. I don't think it's going to need it. You may decide you want to, and it just probably wouldn't even been noticeable if it wasn't for the fact this is so smooth and shiny. And I believe they probably polished this to make sure as it travels through the needle pack and you get an extraordinarily smooth feeling as you are pulling back on the trigger. Now let's talk about that trigger. You got this new trigger, wider, flatter. When I first got it, before I spent a little bit of time with it, I had a lot of fatigue right off the bat. And it wasn't because the trigger was not smooth going back like this. It was very smooth. It's incredibly smooth going back like this. But Harder and Steenbeck's air valve is gradual. So even though it's not much travel, when you first push down on it, a little bit of air comes out. And if you push all the way down on it, more air comes out. So I found myself gripping tighter than I was used to, kind of putting that death grip on there until I kind of got a feel for that. But after a couple of days, I got, the muscle in my finger got used to where that's at, and it was not a problem. Okay, to give an idea of what you can expect with the 0.28, and as a comparison, I'm going to use my Badger Patriot with a super detail setup, my Iwata Eclipse, and my Evolution CR 2024 with the 0.28 setup on it. I have a block, so all three of these are running through this block, so they're all getting the same pressure, and we've got the pressure set right at 30 psi. It'll dip, it'll vary just a little bit because, you know, the Patriot and the Eclipse will pull more air. I have put straight out of the bottle, Createx illustration, Payne's Gray for the Evolution CR 2024. Patriot super detail setup, and the 0.35 Iwata Eclipse. As you can tell, the pattern on the 0.35 Iwata Eclipse is going to be a little bit bigger. We'll get into some finer stuff, but you know, this is not quite, this has just a little bit of reducer in it. Give you an idea. And this is with the guard on there. What kind of tiny lines you can get and how good it atomizes. Now this is, of course, not going to be the best that it's going to get because we haven't put enough reducer in there for this 0.28 to really shine. So I put a little bit of reducer in here. We're not even going to remove the needle guard on here just yet. And to give you a good idea of how small that is about the same thickness as the hash mark on that millimeter, so it is way less than a millimeter thick. We might just, I want to pull that guard off just for fun, and let's see if we can get in here just a little bit closer. Of course, this paint's a little bit pretty reduced. And I could even get just a whisper of a line. Now, clearly, as you can tell, that's not the same as spraying it straight out of the bottle, or, you know, this was about a 20 to 30% reduction. This is about 2 parts of reducer to 1 part of paint when we get down here. And you can absolutely get down here to crazy small levels with the 0.28 and some reducer. See what we can do with some dots here. And we can get some very, very well atomized, nice and soft gradients. And a lot of people are, you know, they don't understand when you talk about a detail airbrush, it's not about how fine these lines can get. Although, I will say, these lines can get as fine as any airbrush I've ever put my hand on. I can get down as fine as any airbrush I have ever used, and with good atomization. But detail airbrushes aren't, that's not the real reason to buy them. It's when you can get those subtle blends at really small spots. When you want to do some blending at a very micro level, that is what you want your detail airbrush for. I can't tell if you can tell that that's a shaded out sphere. I'll try to zoom that in. Hopefully it'll be able to show up on the screen. Yeah, this could be really, really fun at these low pressures, and it atomizes very well at low pressure, and it doesn't put a lot of air out. Now, with that said, it also, no matter how high you turn up the air, you're not going to have that extremely high volume of air no matter what you do to it. So even if you crank the pressure up to 40 psi, these airbrushes don't put out a lot of air, but they do atomize beautifully with a small amount of air. And as you can see, I can continue to run this for a very long time. When it's reduced down like this with this low level of air, you can sit there and work on details for a very, very, very long time without getting any tip dry. Okay, so now let's talk about the responsiveness of the trigger. Because of how low the airflow is, right? You have less of a Venturi effect, so it doesn't strip the paint out of the nozzle as well as something that the airspeed's moving higher or coming out stronger. The more of the pressure drop, the more it can strip paint. So when you get into thick paints, if you're painting with thick paints, you're probably going to notice still, even now, a little bit of that delay. But once it starts spraying, it atomizes extraordinarily well. If you're thinning the paints, treating this like a detail airbrush, the responsiveness is absolutely spot on perfect. It is as responsive as anything else if you're keeping your paints thin. But once again, if you're trying to spray heavier and thicker paints, you might have that slight bit of delay. If you're doing modeling and things like that, it doesn't really matter. You're probably not going to notice that. It's only a very slight hesitation, but once you start pulling the paint out, it doesn't change anything. But if you're thinning your paints out, then you're not going to notice it. It is simply a thing. It's not a fault. It is simply just a thing. In other words, if you design this to run higher air pressure, it could strip the paint out better, may become a little more responsive. But when it does that, then what's going to happen is you're going to lose some of that really soft, very, very fine atomization that it creates in that very small range. And make no mistake about this, this will atomize paint finely as anything I have ever used, as good as anything I have ever used, and better than most of the airbrushes I've ever used. So there's only a couple of airbrushes on the market that can compete with this in quality of line at a super fine level. So who's going to love this airbrush? If you have previous versions of the H&S airbrushes, the 2024 Evolution is an upgrade. It is a better brush than their previous brushes. It's kind of hard to justify, the Infinity, but when they come out with the Infinity head, the new Infinity head, if they do the same improvements to the Infinity head they've done to this Evolution, we're going to see an incredibly precise, well-built machine. And right now, I think this Evolution CR 2024 is a better brush than the current Infinity. In my opinion, I have opinions and that's the way it's going to be. If you're coming from Japanese airbrushes and you start painting bigger stuff and you're wanting thicker paints, you might start getting that same dreaded slight sluggishness in responsiveness on the heavier paints, and that might bug you. So likely somebody who's a huge fan of, like for instance my Iwata Eclipse, is probably not going to feel the same way about this evolution as somebody coming from either a cheap brush or coming from other brushes, because the Iwata Eclipse is a very fast, very responsive brush that works really well with slightly thicker paints. That's not to say that this is subpar to the Eclipse. They're different. This will absolutely beat the pants off my Eclipse in micro line, and I can paint some really tiny lines with my Eclipse, but I can beat the Eclipse with this. And that is what Harder and Steenbeck does really well, is super fine detail stuff. I have not been able to test this with the 0.4 instead of the 0.28, but I don't see it being much difference in its characteristics than the 0.28. I expect it'll be very similar, just it'll handle thicker paints just a little bit better than the 0.28. All right, guys, I know this is a long one, but I wanted to go into a whole lot of stuff. So hopefully you got something out of this video. I am Bill Kennedy, for those of you who do not know, with the Airspace, and I will leave you guys some links on where you can get this airbrush. And I think that's going to be a wrap for today. You can always give me a like, thumbs up, all that good stuff. Leave me some comments and tell me who's going to be picking up one of these CR Pluses. All right? That's going to be a wrap, guys. I appreciate y'all. Y'all have a great day.